There's a lot of confusion out there about oxygen absorbers, so let's look at the facts. Hey Provident Preppers, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Kylene, and John is right. There's a lot of rumors and misconceptions and non-facts floating around out there about oxygen absorbers. So today, we're gonna try and clarify all of that for you.
Yeah.
So this little packet right here is called an oxygen absorber or an oxygen scavenger. All it is powdered iron and salt put in a porous package so that the air can get in and out of it, right? It's totally safe to use, and even though you're putting it in with your food, it doesn't actually come in contact with your food, so there's no problem with it at all there. So what happens is, when it comes in contact with moisture, and we're talking just the small amount of moisture that's in the air, it'll start rusting the iron, which creates a chemical process called oxidation, which will remove the oxygen from the air, and voila, you have an oxygen-free environment. And what these can do, if you do it correctly, it can take the oxygen in a container down to 0.01%. and maintain it. And so that is super cool. Well, actually, it's the container that maintains the oxygen-free environment. This just gets it there.
And we want to make sure that the foods that we are storing are 10% or less in moisture. That is critical. And most of our dry goods fit in that category. We also don't want things that are high in oils or fats, because they do not do well in that environment.
So, and if you're wondering what the moisture content of your food is, I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video to the USDA Agricultural Research Center. And what it has is, it's a little bit confusing to navigate around in it, but after you play with it a little bit, you can put in the name of the food that you want to find out what the moisture content in it is, and it'll show you what that content is. It also shows you the fat content and all kinds of other super valuable information. Now, some of them, they don't show the moisture content, and so sometimes we just have to either call the manufacturer and say, hey, I bought this wheat from you, what moisture content is it, and is it safe to store long-term? Most of the time, they're never gonna commit that it's safe to store. But that's another way that you can find out. But there's also generalities, right? We know that things like rolled oats are well within it. Some varieties of wheat are. We store wheat all the time, but there are some that are higher in moisture and aren't as good of candidates. Now, one of the manufacturers that I was researching actually said 15% moisture. And when I talked to my friend Michelle Call, who has a PhD, she said, well, actually, there are 3 different things that impact your ability to store without getting something like botulism. One is moisture, one is water activity, and the other is the pH of the product. So it's not a hard, fast line, but for those of us who aren't scientists and researchers, we really should just try and stick with less than 10% moisture for those things that we're storing long-term.
Now, there are 2 reasons why we want to use these oxygen absorbers. First of all, oxygen will oxidate our foods, which breaks them down and makes them not as good and not store as long. There's also the insect issue, and this is equally important. If you have eggs or whatever insect,
you have critters crawling
whatever there are in it, you just don't want to give them any opportunity to live and create their mess. So 2 very important reasons why we want to use these. And
there are a whole bunch of other reasons too, and I have a post that I just finished, and there's no way to put all this information in this video, but things like when you prevent oxidation, then suddenly with these oxygen absorbers, you have a higher vitamin content for longer. The food smells better and tastes better. You have a reduction in the opportunity for mold to grow. And there's just all kinds of really good reasons why you should use oxygen absorbers. If you can't, that's okay, right? There are other things that we can do, but it's not gonna have as good of a result. Now, when we look at vacuum sealing compared to oxygen absorbers do a better job. And the reason why they do a better job is because they can take that oxygen down to 0.01%. With a vacuum sealer, even really high quality ones, they're sucking all of the air out, or they're trying to, and it's almost impossible to get the oxygen down that low. However, it does a great job. Like if you can vacuum seal, great, vacuum seal, because you're still going to have a much better result than if you didn't. But make sure the candidates that you vacuum seal, the foods that you're gonna do, are still, they fall into that category where they're a low moisture food, because botulism is a risk. It's not a high risk, but it's still a risk, and the consequences are so high that it's not worth messing with it at all. So let's talk about how we actually use these guys.
As you're probably aware, there's a whole variety of sizes of oxygen absorbers, all the way up from 100 cc up to 2500 cc, and we use these depending on the size of our container. Now, for a gallon size like this.
Okay, this is the bag that all three of these come in, right? These are from Wallaby, and it's a really cool kit that they have that has 3 different sizes in. And one size.
They just use the 400 cc, which is enough for this. It's plenty for this, plenty for this. But sometimes it's just easier to have one size and to use them.
And so that's totally what I do. So if you want to take that for a second. So this is how I keep my oxygen absorbers. I actually like Wallabies because they come in these little 10 packs, right? Sometimes you can buy them a little bit cheaper from someplace else online, but then you've got 100 of these to deal with at once. And in my opinion, they're exposed to too much air and I go through them too fast. So what I do is whatever size open I have, that's what I use for everything that I am using them for, right? And so when these are done in this jar, I will just open this and put these in here. Now, you need to make sure that you've got a good seal on this jar because you don't want any oxygen coming in and out, right? The other thing that you could do is you could actually seal the leftovers inside of a Mylar bag, but to me that's a little bit on the wasteful side. So these I just use over and over again and it works really well. You could even use a smaller jar, but I wouldn't oversize the jar because these little guys are gonna have to work to remove whatever's oxygen's in here. And you'll notice like in a half an hour, 30 minutes, an hour, it'll pop this down again and it'll reseal it. So with the oxygen absorbers, say you don't have a 2500 one, but you want to seal stuff in a plastic bucket, right, inside of a Mylar bag, then you can just add these up. You can do, instead of 2500, you can do 500. You can make it work any way you want. And it's just fine to put more in, but if you put less in, you're still gonna have oxygen in there, which means you might have some oxidation taking place, but the growth of those bugs. So we wanna make sure we size it correctly.
As Kylie mentioned, these from Wallaby come in packets of 10, with the exception of these larger ones, the 2000s and the 2500s, they are single packeted. So there's just one in here. That is just a great feature that I think just allows us not to have to open a whole bunch.
Yeah, and I really love that about those because I don't ever have to worry whether or not they're spent. And one of the ways that you can tell whether or not they are expired, spent, or I can't remember the other name for it, exhausted, is they'll kind of turn hard and crunchy and be discolored a little bit. Now, they can have stopped the process a long time before that happens, but that's one way that you can tell for certain that they're not good anymore. So let's talk about how you use an oxygen absorber. These are all things that we've packaged, and sometimes we think that we can only use them in Mylar, and that's so not true. Mylar is a fantastic way to go. Ooh, we should talk about this. Feel it. Okay, this is warm. And that means that it has started the chemical process. It's going to warm up. And sometimes what you'll notice in the jar is you'll see that these will get wet because what's happening, remember, it's that water, this is heating up and you'll be able to see some of the condensation. You look back at this jar in an hour or so and that'll all be gone. If this happens to be damp when you're gonna go to use it, just wipe it off with a nice dry towel, stick it in there. You don't have to worry about that at all. It's just a natural part of the process. Now, so with the oxygen, or with the Mylar bags, I just pop it in here, put my food in here, seal it up, but then you're not done because some people are worried that their Mylar bags it's not working, but you have to heat seal this. You have to seal it with like a flat iron, like a hair straightener, or an impulse sealer if you have one, but it does have to be totally heat sealed. Now, while I'm on Mylar, let's talk about something else real quick. So I want to show you a couple of examples. Do you see how this looks like it's vacuum sealed and it's super hard? And this is still puffy. It's totally fine. Both of these have had the oxygen removed from them and they are safe to store. You do need to protect Mylar from rodents, right? And so that's an important feature, but just because this is puffy, what nitrogen or air is what?
It's 79% nitrogen and about 21% oxygen. There's a few other inert gases in there, but that's the general ratio. So you know that only about a fifth of that air is oxygen, so the nitrogen's not getting absorbed.
And it's just fine for the food,
yeah.
Right? And so you don't have to worry about that. So if you're worried, you just need to check, like squeeze it and see if you see or feel any air leaking out at all. But it doesn't have to look like this. This just happens sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. The thinner Mylar bags, sometimes you'll get more of that vacuum sealed look than on the thicker Mylar. But it really, you don't have to worry about that. Now, so we talked about the Mylar. If you want to store your food in PET plastic bottles, there's been a study shown that like these soda bottles, this PET bottle will maintain a low oxygen environment for at least 1 year. That's as far as the study went, but we know that it's going to maintain that environment for at least a year. So that's long enough to take care of a lot of the bugs. And this, I pulled it out and there wasn't a date on it, but the other stuff I've done is 2005 or 2006, and this is wheat. So I'm a little bit embarrassed that it doesn't have a date or a date and a name on it, but it doesn't, and that just happens sometimes. So I put the oxygen absorber in the bottom here, fill it up with food, seal it up tight. That's a practically free way, except for the food and the oxygen absorber, to be able to store your food. And then we reuse these all the time. Now the other way that I store the food is in mason jars, and you'll notice these are chocolate chips. And I actually had to talk to Michelle, and who's my friend, who's the scientist, the brilliant one, to tell me if this is right or wrong. But this is low enough in moisture that you can use an oxygen absorber with it and extend this shelf life. So that's all I did. Put the oxygen absorber in, fill it up, seal it off.
And the real question is, why do we still even have any chocolate left?
I know!
That must have gotten lost somewhere in our storage. And anyway.
It's here now. Anyway, but now there's one thing that I do differently with some of the freeze-dried food, because the freeze-dried food is super susceptible to moisture, right? So I put my oxygen absorber in the bottom and I fill it up. And then a lot of times I will vacuum seal this. And it's because sometimes 24 hours later, my lid won't have popped down. And I don't know for certain that it's got a good long-term seal on it. So when I put it in the freeze dryer and put it on the vacuum seal setting, immediately I know that this sucks down, but it still has this oxygen absorber in it, so that I know the oxygen is gone as well as it's sealed, and then this can be a long-term storage item. We do a lot of stuff that's freeze-dried. Like this is rotisserie chicken, of course without the skin, and it's been rinsed off. But this, I mean, I've got a good 10, 20-year shelf life of rotisserie chicken right there on my shelf, and so I love that. And it wouldn't be possible without the oxygen absorbers. So they are super helpful in making sure that we maintain the good high quality that we want to be there when we open it up after it's been on our shelf for a while.
Your oxygen absorber is only going to be as effective as your container is. We need to emphasize that. You have to make sure that you have a good quality container. We talked about the glass, or the PET, the Mylar bags. Obviously, if there's some pinholes in here, you're going to have air leakage back in. So you need to make sure you have a good quality container to make this work.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. Glass is completely non-permeable, right? This will never allow the oxygen to transmit through the walls. Mylar are fantastic that way, and they're a really good resource. Plastic, however, over time it will, and this is one of the reasons why we put a Mylar liner inside of a plastic bucket before we put in the food in, because over time that plastic will allow oxygen through those walls. Now, I'm going to be quite frank with you. We buy a lot of our wheat from a local farmer, and we love him to pieces, but how he stores it, he takes the buckets and he dumps in the wheat and he puts oxygen absorbers in there and he seals it. That is not ideal. Is it taking care of the bugs? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Over time, that wheat is not going to store as well. So we figure it's not a problem because we're not planning on storing that wheat for 30 years, right? That's a really good quality wheat that we just rotate through in our regular cooking, and so we might have it on the shelf for maybe 10 or 15 years, and that's just fine doing it that way. But the container really matters, and you've got to decide whether you want good, better, or best. And sometimes good is just fine.
One area where we see a lot of questions and confusion is these desiccant packets.
They kind of look a lot like these,
They look
right?
very similar. They're little packets that
But they're not.
you see in all kinds of things, from shoes and all kinds of things, but these absorb moisture. They're not made to absorb oxygen. They don't absorb oxygen. These do not absorb moisture.
Oh, a little
Well,
teeny, they do
kind of a little
bit.
to create the process.
Yeah.
But their purpose is to absorb oxygen. These are to absorb moisture. So we do get some confusion about these, and people asking, you know, should I be using one? Should I be using the other? Should I be using both? Definitely you want to use the oxygen absorber. In most cases you don't need to use a desiccant packet, although some people prefer to use that, and Mama, tell them if they're going to, how to do that.
Okay, so, and first of all, let's make sure that we understand, like, there are food grade and there are non-food grade about this, or desiccant packets. So you need to make sure that you're looking at the food grade and not ever putting things that aren't food grade in there. And there's diatomaceous earth ones and silica, and there's all kinds of different ones. And we'll do a different video about that. But for the most part, you've got to be really careful, because if you put that next to this in your food storage, remember, we want the oxygen gone. This is these desiccants are gonna make it so the oxygen absorber can't do their job. And so what is happening is you're putting both of these in there and you're not benefiting your food storage. So we don't recommend that you use these. You wanna buy your food when it's 10%, right? You don't wanna buy 15% and say, oh, I'll put in enough desiccant that I'm gonna take that moisture level down. Why not?
It can't do it. These can only absorb about 40% of their weight. So, and if you look at, say, a bucket of wheat that maybe was 15% moisture, you would have to have like 10 bags of these, not these little bags, like a whole 6 pounds or something like that in there. It just can't do the job. These absorb a little bit of moisture, but they can't do it on that kind of a scale. So they're really not meant for that purpose. So
don't ever use them with that purpose in mind. But the thing that you might want to do, here we live in Utah and our weather is really dry. However, if you live in a place that's super humid and you're trying to package your dry foods and there's a lot of moisture in the air, that might be a time, maybe, that you would want to use one. And these cannot be next to each other in the packet or in the bucket or the container. So what I would do is I'd put the desiccant in the bottom, I'd dump all the dry food on top, and then I put the oxygen absorber on the top and seal it up. Just be careful and kind of do a little bit of investigating, right? Because sometimes we think, oh, if one is good, 100 would be good. And that's not necessarily the case. Now these, you can't use too many, but, oh, did you hear it clip? You know, if you want to overdo these and use twice as much, you know, go for it. But the same thing can't be said of these. You're gonna cause a problem. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Now, if you are going to use desiccant packets for some reason, there are rechargeable and non-rechargeable. So some of these, both of these, you can actually use the microwave or you can use your oven, and these can be dried back out and reused. Some of those you can't do that. There are some large desiccant packets that are definitely rechargeable, and you put them in your oven for several hours on a low temperature, and then you can recharge and reuse those. So just another thing that you may want to look at if you are going to use some desiccant packet for some reason.
Yeah, just look at the container, right, and read the directions. Now, with desiccant, you should never use it in sugar, in salt, in flour, or anything that's powdery. And I thought this was really interesting because remember, I'm doing a lot of research trying to learn and I'm going to really credible sources. And the reason why you don't want to do that is because those items have to maintain a certain level of moisture to be able to remain active, like and be able to shake and move. They'll turn clumpy if you add a desiccant to them. And that's counterintuitive, right? And so when I found that, I thought, oh, I definitely have to share that with you. And then the other thing with oxygen absorbers, we talked about the risk of like botulism, right? Even though it's really low, so that's why you want to use it in foods that are low in moisture. Well, if you put, an oxygen absorber in sugar or salt, it's going to turn it hard. The other two things that you shouldn't put an oxygen absorber in are baking soda and baking powder. So just so you know, you don't always do everything to everything, right? There are reasons why we do it. So with the oxygen absorber, less than 10% moisture, low in oils will store the longest. And then don't put it in sugar, salt, baking soda, or baking powder. And you got this.
We want to thank our friends at Wallaby for all the good information they provide and for great products. If this is something that you need, take a look at Wallaby. We're very comfortable with their quality, and they've given us a promo code Provident5, and they will give you a discount if that's something you need to do. Also, question of the day. What did we miss? What confusion, what questions do you still have? Fire away, comment below, and thanks for being part of the solution.